Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Fire These Times. My name is Ayman, and this episode is the second part of a two-part episode, a roundtable on my latest video essay, Where Are the Arabs? It's on YouTube, it's free to watch, but even if you haven't watched it, this episode could still be interesting because we unpack the themes and explore them a bit further, and in a way that's still accessible, again, even if you haven't watched the video essay, although I do recommend that you watch it. That said, this episode does build off of things that were discussed in the first part of this episode, so I do recommend you check that out before listening to this one. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy this episode. There's this weird thing that we can talk about certain contexts, histories, different places, with nuance, with analysis, with from the left, like people use this like scientific socialist or like Marxist view, but then when it comes to the contemporary, when it comes to our region, people just exist in a fantasy. And this is part of the reason why I did this video essay, because the only other people I saw talking about this, they would use a kind of empirical scientific analysis to talk about the history, but then presently, nothing. It starts becoming just, I don't know how to describe it. Like it just does not replicate or reflect the realities that we see.
I also want to add the risk that you took in making this analysis, because not only are you seen as a defeatist, but you're actually seen as a collaborator and like a traitor, which is a whole nother thing. Like the silence, it's like, okay, it's either be seen as a traitor or shut my mouth. And I don't want to be seen as that. I'm not a traitor. I am with my people. I am with my homeland. I'm with I'm against the oppression, but I can't, there is no room. And so I'm just going to shut up and take it.
Which I've gotten some comments like that, and I reject it completely, and it's really frustrating.
I mean, the number of times I've been called a Zionist, just words don't matter. I mean, I would have an essay like that day that is like, here is a 10,000 words of why I think Zionism is bad. It's one of those things where like how do you say this? Like the goalpost to even prove your worthiness is by definition, just it's never going to be there. It will always be moved. And by some of the same definitions used today, someone like Edward Said, Ghassan Kanafani, Mahmoud Darwish would all be considered collaborators and traitors because they were just willing to say, well, yes, Israel is the big baddie, but there's quite a lot of other baddies that are also a huge part of the problem. And there's this bizarre need to have a hierarchy because, of course, on some level, I get it, but that hierarchy is contextual as well. Like if you're a Syrian in Yarmouk being bombed by the Assad regime, the fact that your main enemy right now is the Assad regime does not mean that you're suddenly on the side of Israel. It just means that you have barrel bombs to worry about falling, from the skies. And it's just one of those things that when again, I guess to some extent what I'm saying is that it feels also like the how to say this, like the other side of the same coin of this depoliticization, which is ironic because it comes from people who ostensibly are very political, as you said. It's just that when it comes to the present, quote unquote, and the present is sometimes extended to like until the 70s, basically, onwards, especially when it comes to Lebanon, um, it ends up becoming this entire mess where people are talking about post October 7th while referencing Ghassan Kanafani from the early 1970s, completely decontextualized from what he was talking about at the time. Because as if like, well, this is the same thing he's been talking about. And to some extent, even emotionally, there's some resonance there. Because the project of Zionism and colonialism, all of that is clearly still with us. Um, but he was also a guy who was killed when he was 36, which is what I turned in 2 years, which is, weird to think about. But where for him, the Nakba was recent memory. It wasn't, he was born in Akka, I believe, in 36 or something like that. I don't have the in front of me. So he was like 12 when it happened. And so for him, it's like, I think about it like I don't know, I've been part of the diaspora on and off for 12 years, more or less, 10 years. So that's how long the Nakba, that's how far back it is in that proportionally speaking, whatever, when it comes to him, relationally speaking, when it comes to him. So he was talking about a world where it did feel like it can go back to some extent. But he was also smart enough to know that like it is not about going back, it is actually about moving forward. And to do that, you need to deal with the problems at hand, which is, yes, obviously Zionism, but also these Arab states that are either outright collaborationists, as he mentioned, like the Saudis, the Jordanians, and the Moroccans at the time and today,
Yeah.
um,
Still,
or
yeah.
the bourgeoisie ones like Syria and I don't know who else he listed as well.
Military petit
Um,
bourgeoisie. Yeah.
yes, military bourgeoisie. So like, and that same Syria, for example, that he was talking about got so much worse since then, since that interview, no comparison. Bourgeoisie is like ideal compared to what Assad became, Hafez especially, but I mean not especially Hafez and then Bashar. But anyway, all of this to say that um, even though we know that now for a fact that, as you mentioned, for example, a good chunk of why Hezbollah ended up kind of having this massive defeat is that they simply did not plan for it. And I will admit, I think all of us to some extent were surprised by that. You know? I had this conversation with so many friends all the time as it was happening because, all of these high-ranking members were killed day after day and whatnot, until Nasrallah himself, of course. And then Safieddin the day after, not so, yeah, like the day, like a week after or something. Um, his cousin and the one who was supposed to be the leader after him. Um, and what was surprising is like, how did they not plan for this? And even when Nasrallah was killed, it was like, how was he still there? Stuff like that. Whatever. The details don't really matter as much, and this will be too long of a niche conversation. Um, but there is something to it. Like ultimately, his very last speech, or the one after, actually, the one before, sorry, the one before his very last speech, because his very last speech is when he sounded extremely tired, which was after the Pages attacks. But the one before that is when he was basically taunting Netanyahu to his face, basically saying like, "I'm addressing to you, and I promise you, you will never be able to, the Israelis of the North will never be able to go back, and mark my words and whatnot." But then, when I heard that, I was like, okay, then surely, surely there is a plan to make that happen, other than continue doing what they were already doing. And there wasn't. There just wasn't. Um, and that was the like I realized that even me, I've written a dozen essays on Hezbollah, and I've been called Zionist and collaborator and whatnot by their own people and their apologists and whatnot. Even I, to some extent, bought into the hype
Because it has
because,
to, it has to. Like it's
yeah,
like his life was at stake. Like they knew it.
exactly,
But it's like,
exactly.
and all of us, but like, so there it was that shock of just, wait, the rhetoric was just, or yeah, the goading, because the thing that they had been doing for months up until the like complete escalation, that they like when the Israelis fully engaged in
Yeah,
Lebanon,
yeah.
was like slowly revealing, like that the drone that they had over Haifa, um,
Or the
10
video in the tunnel.
and the tunnel, and there was like this kind of thing of like slowly releasing and like showing new weapons, and it's like, oh, okay, but it was propaganda. Like it was propaganda, like regardless. But there was not actually that thing. I mean, that's a possibility. There's a possibility that like genuinely they were actually like so heavily bombarded in the first few days. But regardless, back to the Kanafani point, I do find that very interesting because a lot of people, and I really don't like the reduction of Kanafani into clips,
Hmm.
because and this is something that I want to do more with this kind of like deeper dives into some of these people and some of these ideas. It's like a lot of the people who quote Kanafani would not like Kanafani if they actually read him. Kanafani would not side with this. And
If they
so,
if they had read Return to Haifa.
no. Or, I mean, even the manifesto, like the manifesto that I
Hmm.
quote. So they describe in the manifesto, and this is the manifesto of the Popular Front of the Liberation of Palestine, written in like 1970, 1969. They list, they're like, okay, let's lay things out. Who are our allies? Who are our enemies? What are the strategies? What are the tactics? Who are the enemies? They list four: world imperialism, global Zionism, Israel, and Arab reaction. And this isn't like in a scale of 1 to 4, like this is just the four that exist. And for some reason, most people that like quote Kanafani and again just use him as a kind of like, oh, I'm radical, I quote Kanafani, um, ignore that fourth one, which again is functionally now like all Arab regimes are. At the time, there was a thing of like Arab like progressivism, which again, like the beginning of the Assad regime or the Ba'athists, the Nasser, like these were seen as like progressives, not as in like revolutionary, but like they were antagonistic to whatever colonialism. But in the manifesto, and I find this really fucking interesting, in the manifesto of possibly the most militant Palestinian group, armed, advocate for working class revolution, armed struggle, all of these things. In the manifesto in 1969, what they were advocating for was a single democratic state for all of the people in that land who want to live under a single democratic state. And the logic is those who are there, the settlers who are only there because they can exist under the state that gives them domination and hegemony and supremacy, they would leave because there's no longer a state to protect them, to give them that domination. And so people who use this and then have like a very different, sometimes to me, like uncritical, like they don't actually like think thoroughly about whatever. They didn't want to do an Algeria situation, but I see a lot of people today saying, like, quoting Kanafani and being like, therefore we should kick 8 million people out. Like, that's not even what he was saying. And so it's like, are these posters, rad posters, as I call them, are they more radical than Hassan Kanafani? Like, I don't think so. I think they're cosplaying as more radical. And I see these people in my comments, like some of these comments that, are calling me a Zionist. And honestly, I don't think white people understand how violent it is to call an Arab a Zionist. That is literally one of the worst thing you could. Like, I could be jailed. But, like, not just I could be jailed, but that is, like, to make me identified with my oppressor. It is so fucking violent. And they throw it out there because
But we should emphasize that we can be jailed because it is quite literally illegal in Lebanon to be seen as being a quote-unquote collaborator. So even if there is any kind of suspicion or whatnot, you can quite literally be jailed. Like, it is a thing. And even worse in other countries, Lebanon, relatively speaking, but it's still bad.
Yeah. And so, like, that's why I mean it's violent. Like, it's not violent just because it hurts my feelings. Like, it could have real fucked up implications. And so it is something that needs to become, like, it's charged. Like, you need to actually have. And so I get these people writing, and it's like, what are you even talking about? Like, why? Because I'm criticizing the Assad regime? Like, how does that make me a Zionist? Because I like
when the very first video that you release is on Zionism.
Exactly, but they're not going to watch that. Or that basically what I'm saying is that, and if you look at the history, and again, I've gotten to the point now that I forgot what it was like before I did the research. That phase where it's like, oh, right, this isn't obvious to most people. But like, if you read more about Assad's, the Hafiz al-Assad when he went into Lebanon in 1976 to defend the same people that the Israelis' allies, the Phalange, like, there were communications between the Syrians and the Israelis. I've talked to people who were in Lebanon in 1982, in Shia areas, in Uza'i, and they're like Amal, which is still around today, they didn't resist. They let the Israelis come in. And some people are like, and like, again, so I see people today posting like the Shia duo and like Nabih Berri and being like, he's part of the resistance. What the fuck are you talking about? Sorry, I get so pissed off because it's so bizarre.
Very quickly, Ayman, you're referring to Amal being the main ally of Hezbollah today. Nabih Berri was the leader, is still the leader of Amal. And what you're referencing is that during the civil war in Lebanon in the early 80s, Amal, it's actually one of the reasons why that ended up being a Hezbollah, kind of the resentment that fed into that in the long term. but Amal was seen as kind of complacent with the Israeli occupation, and even in some extents, like collaborationist, because Amal was extremely, I would argue, still is extremely anti-Palestinian. And the Shia duo is a sectarian term that is used for like the two main Shia parties being Hezbollah and Amal today.
But yeah, they massacred Palestinians in the war on the camps. Like Assad coming in, invading or yeah, intervening in Lebanon in 76, he destroyed the Palestinians. He destroyed the Lebanese national movement. Like this isn't just, I don't know, a slight influence or he wrote on Twitter like a hot take. Like he destroyed the infrastructure and whatever, and like yeah, set the scene. And this history fucking matters. And
Yeah.
same with Assad. Like to me, it's the kind of thing of when if people are like Syria is the backbone of the resistance, and it's like what capacity does the Syrian state have to resist if the entire country has been destroyed by Bashar al-Assad? Like just at a very practical thing, like if we're talking about resistance, and then it's like okay, so like manufacturing of arms or something, the entire country is fucking destroyed. They don't have enough to make bread, let alone weapons. Like it's so basic, and this is what frustrates me so much about this fantasy. And this is part of the reason why like Edward Said is so important to me, especially in specifically in terms of the Western obsession or like the kind of fantasy and fantasization of our region, wherein these histories, these like the economy, that's very the society ceases to matter. It is purely a place where they can project their fantasies and their fears. And so,
Mhm.
so much of the discourse feels like so irrelevant to me, but it's like it's there. A lot of people are listening to it. A lot of people are buying into it. It's at best a distraction. At worst, it's like something that like really needs to be pushed back on, because if you're an Arab, if you're a Palestinian or a Syrian or a Lebanese, and you're like, I want to get engaged to better my conditions, you have certain things in your way, people around you, people against you, that like just is completely ignored by these meta narratives, by these geopolitical narratives, by this like the fantasy of essentially these tankies. Um, and I will say by the Arab regimes, by what we call like Mumena in Lebanon, like. Anyway, so this is honestly like a lot of this video essay comes from a deep frustration of the lack of communication on these things and conversations on these
Mhm.
things and like an openness. I see a lot of people talking in codes, talking in slogans, but they don't actually know what they're advocating for or have a full coherent analysis where it's like, okay, and like, so what are we going to do? Like, what's the next step?
Mhm. Mhm.
And sometimes, oftentimes, it's just not there. And so I find myself terrified in this age of collapse. Like we need to have some strategy, some actual coherent narrative of like where have we been, where are we now, and where are we going?
I'm the same. Just gotten. It doesn't even bother me anymore at this point because it's just been so long. This just the same reaction that is either very aggressive, again, calling Zionist, whatever, or and this can feel worse, to be honest, can hurt more, which is like the people that know this is wrong but are kind of silent about it because it's so taboo to talk about this. It's really taboo. I did my master's. I mean, you guys know, but and some of the listeners, I've mentioned this before. But I did my master's on Yiddish and Hebrew, the politics of those two languages, and within Jewish political thought of the 20th century. And I remember an uncle of mine, well, my godfather, basically saying like, "You're trying to be provocative, aren't you?" And I joked around. I was like, "Yeah, I guess I am." But it was interesting. It's an interesting reaction because I just picked a theme that for me was very alien, and I had this opportunity to explore it, and I did. And that was kind of the extent of my intention, if you want. And that has given me obviously the tools to not just be an anti-Zionist because bad, but like I thoroughly understand it, you know?
Mm.
I'm able to read and like and you did the same for your video essay as well, Ayman. Like there are elements of it where like I even empathize in the early days. Not with Herzl because he was a piece of shit, but like with like members who were like, "Oh, the situation is so bad here, we have to find something," and then there's something almost didn't matter, or the details like that. But none of that, of course, matters because of how it ended up. but I'm able to have this to just inhabit these different nuances in my head, and that at no point does it weaken my opposition to Zionism. If anything, it just gave me all of these extra tools to use to dismantle it from within effectively, more effectively, I would argue. But to do that, I had to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. You know, I
Mm.
had to be okay with, and this took some time, but like being willing at least to entertain the possibility that I might be wrong. And then actually being kind of happy that no, actually I'm not wrong, but I'm not wrong in a more interesting way,
Mm.
you know? There's something different about the fact that it is correct and it is right to be against Zionism, but to understand the nuances of why is this still a thing? Why does it still exist? Yeah, I'm repeating myself a bit, I guess. Like just having the tools to actually deal with it in a way that is complex because it is complex.
Yeah. And I will say, so there's two things that actually that's making me think of. In my first video essay, I used this clip from Mahmoud Darwish. And again, I see this, it's a monologue from a film by Jean-Luc Godard. It's a film called Notre Musique.
Not
And
music from 2004.
four, yeah. But like
Yeah.
he says a lot of stuff. And one thing that I think people don't want to reckon with is when he says, even if I were in the victor's camp, I would still stand with the victim. Like even if I was the one, like if our roles are reversed. And that is echoed as well in another interview by Edward Said, where he's like, the point isn't that now it's our turn. And he sees that a lot in the PA. He gives an anecdote about a friend of his son who is now an interrogator for the Palestinian Authority. And he's like, wait, but you're torturing Palestinians and they were torturing you and now you're torturing, I mean, not them, but other Palestinians. And he's like, yeah, they did it then, now it's our turn. And it's like, that is not a justice, that's not liberation, but that's also not something that people are really going to get on board with. But anyway, I think there is, to speak back towards this thing, that I think it's very rare to talk about this anti-intellectual atmosphere in general of the last 50 years, but even presently. And I find this something very startling, which is when I do research on Arab nationalism and like critiques, there are very few Arab sources that I've found. I am going to be very transparent here that my research skills in Arabic are very poor. And so like I am relying on like Arabs that are writing within English. And so like of the bigger whatever, I could not find that much. I did, however, find a lot of Zionists, like literally Israeli historians, like writing in whatever university, Hebrew university. And then I obviously did not cite any of these things and they weren't really necessary. But the important point here is that like when I was researching the Phoenicianist movement in Lebanon, which is very tied to right-wing Christian political parties who are like, we're not Arab, we're actually Phoenician, i.e. we're long-lost Europeans. And this is a huge thing in Lebanon, honestly. The only two books I could find on the matter were written by two Israeli historians. And so there's this huge gap of knowledge production of our own societies by ourselves, but also beyond that, of their society, And again, a lot of these people who quote Kanafani, who quote Arafat, who quote the PLO, they never reckon with the fact, and I did this in the first video essay, that in the 60s, the PLO had a publishing press, a publishing house, where some of the books, and they even taught Hebrew classes, like in Beirut, because even if it's just from a place of anti-Zionism, then it's like, well, we should be able to read their newspapers, to be able to understand what they're saying, even if it's just about what they're saying about us. And Megaphone, like to my mind, one of the best like independent news organizations in the region. It's based in Lebanon, but like definitely in like the Levant, it's par none. What they were doing during the aggression in Lebanon, especially once it escalated, is translating key articles from Hebrew press.
It made me so happy that they're doing this.
Are they still?
Yeah, they're still doing this.
That's really fucking good. But you look at the comments and they're like, oh, why are you reading that? Like, what are you trying to share their propaganda? Are you going to become like them? And it's just it again fucks with me where it's like, why wouldn't you? Like, you are limiting so much our capacity to understand the very situation, the fucked situation that we're in.
Meanwhile, the IDF has Arabic spokespersons and entire research centers dedicated to quote unquote studying us, you know?
ما عم بقلك. And
Yeah.
that's very effective.
Yeah, it is.
Um, And so, yeah, to me, there's like a necessity. And like, I understood, I remembered like 10 years ago when you were still on Twitter, like, I saw you publishing, talking about your thesis, master's, and I was like, that's actually really cool. And like, I know no one is doing it. And it's also like a big risk because even just engaging in it. And again, I use this quote by Edward Said where he says, even just mentioning Israel in the press in the 60s would label you a kind of national security threat.
Yeah.
And so there's this like actual stifling of like, no, no, don't even talk about it. Because if you're talking about it, you're sus. And if you're sus, then we're going to interrogate you.
I want to tie what you're just bringing in to like the domestic or like to us as Arabs. So I have this similar experience to when I listened to Sheikh Imam in Egypt, right? And Sheikh Imam is being like Ayman, you used it throughout the video essay. But when I'm sitting there and I'm listening to him, especially on speaker in my apartment, and I know how much the sound reverberates and everyone's on top of each other, and you could hear what like the apartment next door to you, what they're talking about, like everything. And I'm like, I start getting really paranoid. And I'm like, oh, maybe I should put on my headphones, maybe I should do this. Because like within that context, Sheikh Imam is critiquing the bourgeoisie, he's critiquing the ruling class, and that itself is enough to be a problem, right? And I know I'm not the only Egyptian who feels the same way. And so, yeah, like not only is it a problem with this external enemy, but then again, like this inner critique of like when we can't even do it with the people who are critiquing our people, right? Like the same mechanisms are being used to silence and fear and all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Sheikh Imam is fantastic. I actually had an earlier draft where I spent like 10, 20 minutes talking about Sheikh Imam. Sheikh Imam is a Egyptian folk singer in collaboration with this Egyptian poet, Fuad Nigme.
Nigam, yeah.
Nigma, yeah, and they were both regularly imprisoned under Sisi, sorry, under Abdel Nasser and Anwar Sadat. And part of the reason that I wanted to is because I do have at the beginning two songs. I have Wayn al Malayin, Where Are the Millions, and The Arab Dream. And what I wanted to do is to juxtapose those two expressions and Sheikh Imam. Why? Because first of all, the content. So like you said, for example, the song Build Your Castles, Shayyid Qusurak, it's very much so against the capitalist, the bourgeoisie, the state. And they're building their castles and they're throwing us in prison and there's a line there that I really wanted to have in there. وَعَرِفْنَا سَبَبْ جِرَاحْنَا. Now we know the reason for our pains, for our injuries. And together, farmers, workers, farmers, and students, we will revolt together and go down this path of revolution, essentially. But then he also has really great songs that I have in the thing of like Ya Falastiniye. And so just in content, it sounds so much better. It is so much more potent and real and talks about like a thought, like the revolution and liberation. And the other songs, they're like love songs. One day we'll be together at the end of the rainbow. But then also, and this I really want to say, is when you look at who wrote those songs, the Arab Dream and Wayn al Malayin, who wrote them, who sung them? Specifically with Wayn al Malayin, Julia Boutros, who's a Lebanese singer, who a lot of people love. She has bangers, I'm not going to deny it. And she has resistance bangers, hardcore Assadist. I have a photo that I was going to put of her meeting Bashar al-Assad in 2018. but she literally wrote, for him and whatever. And so there's this, and then in the Arab Dream, the guy who wrote the song is actually quite young. He's still around. He's like 50, 60 years old. Huge Sisi supporter. Jordan. He has an Instagram. تحية للمملكة الأردنية, to like the Jordanian monarchy, to the Saudi monarchy. It's like, what do you mean the Arab Dream when you are like lauding the butchers of Arabs? And so I wanted to juxtapose that with Sheikh Imam, who I have a clip that I, again, regret that I did not put on, but it just didn't fit, of him being interviewed and asked why you don't play in the Gulf. And he says, لأنهم ولاد كلب, because they're sons of bitches. And I hold myself responsible for that. That's a stance. That's a stance. Compared to all these court musicians that we have who are like singing maybe about like, oh, Arab unity, but it's like they're not actually saying anything political. And so, yeah, I definitely know your concerns with listening to him, but it is fucked. He's an Egyptian musician. He's one of the most famous, whatever. For a while, he was like illegal, I think, in Lebanon. Like they were like forbidden. There is just so much in our history, in our culture that's like suppressed, but also misunderstood. Like Julia Butros, to me, I never share her music or whatever. And to me, it's like a hypocrisy that she's like, Wain al Malayin. Like, girl, your guy is massacring them.
I want to add one more thing, and that's the like you use the video in a snippet in the video essay of the Jordanian what's his face, the Jordanian king, and the monthly propaganda of the military, and linking it to the conversation that we were having about Nasrallah and the boasting and the flexing and all this. And like as we're here talking about it, I was like, I think these videos are more to scare the people than they are actually about, again, the external enemy. I mean, we see the same thing. I see the same thing in Egypt and Sisi, and I've actually seen a surge of this stuff since the fall of Assad. It's like almost every other commercial is these like Hollywood level production of G.I. Joe Egyptians and acrobats and like jumping off buildings and climbing down from the helicopter and like all these
and
crazy
shooting at sand dunes.
Literally, right? Like it's crazy stuff. High, like millions and millions and millions of dollars have gone into these like Hollywood level production. And the marching band in the background and this like speech of like, they will not get us, they will not this and that. But who's he actually talking to? He's talking to the people, because at the same time you're seeing the increased stormtroopers on the street, like with their full-on riot gears at all times in front of every mosque during Jummah prayers, and like leading up to the 25th anniversary, every place, including like the shopping spaces, right? Like the Menshia in Alexandria, which is a historical like suit, right? With like not necessarily like the center of politics, but it is a center of a place of people just coming together and being really busy, and just seeing a huge influx of military to the point that people are like, is something happening today? Right. But it's just, no, we don't want, it's scary to have people come together. And so these videos aren't to scare, like, yes, they flex and blah, 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 but we're getting called out in the bluff. And the ones who are being scared and silenced and shut down are the people themselves.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's something that is like one of the main things in my video essay, where I'm like, in order for us to, as Arabs, have any meaningful impact, to be able to do anything, like there is something directly in our way, and that's our regimes, our police, our riot police, our bourgeoisie in many ways. And that is so heavily neglected when, we just talk about them. We talk about the West, we talk about Israel. And that's really important. We constantly need to be talking about them. But again, in that same way that in like the 69 PFLP manifesto, these are all kind of, it's a network. And literally just, we can't. Like you can't even really boycott, let alone do and like support in more direct action ways, which again, all these regimes were against. The Jordanians with Black September, Assad with like Assad, his whole thing, in Syria and in Lebanon. Egypt, even Abdel Nasser, he was really against like Palestinian militants or like other like Egyptian groups like in the Sinai. But so I have a huge thing, and I know this is a big discussion that's been raged for like 50 years, and I don't have a conclusive answer, but I wish people would talk about it a bit more directly, which is, you know what I mean? And this is where Hamas even comes from. Like, what's the difference between them and the Muslim Brotherhood? The Muslim Brotherhood are like, we need to liberate the Ummah, the Islamic Ummah, the nation of Muslims, in order to then liberate Palestine. And Hamas's like when they broke away from them, they were like, no, 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 the opposite. We need to liberate Palestine first, and that will then allow for the whatever. That gets a bit more whatever, but again, that's the parallel between like the Islamic nationalism and the Arab nationalism, and both have that same tension of should we be focusing on our own liberation to then be able to assist Palestinians, or should we focus on the Palestinians to then do our own? I don't think it's one or the other, but there's definitely one thing that's completely neglected, and you see that when Trump kind of humiliates King Abdullah in the White House, in the Oval Office, and then people come out and they're like, tahiyya or like tadamun like solidarity with the King of Jordan, when it's like, dude is literally the worst, and historically and still to this day, and like his grandfather was assassinated because of his collaboration. But like, regardless,
Yeah, let's forget that he's literally shooting down missiles that are like, we'll forget all that, right? Like, we'll forget about their active participation in the occupation.
Yeah, like all of it. And it's starting with Black September, but regardless, it's like the need to like resist those regimes is part of the same kind of struggle. And so that's why I do this video essay. That's why I talk a lot about Syria, and I still talk about Syria. And I resist so much people's discursive thing, which like in my mind is kind of replicating some Zionist narratives where like Syrians don't exist. It's all just ISIS. Sorry, that's a weird thing to put at the very end, but like that we do need to be taking seriously Arab solidarities, not just Arab, sorry, like people within this region, like building solidarities between ourselves, and strengthening our capacity to resist, but also to build and to organize, and and like focusing genuinely on like actually who are our antagonists and oppressors, and who are our allies, and who are our solidarities that we can be like harnessing. I don't know if Elia, if you want to wrap it up.
As we're trying to be more diligent about pluggables and whatnot, I'll start by saying people can follow me on Blue Sky and Mastodon, mostly Blue Sky. If you just write Ayoub, a family name, it should pop up. I also have a newsletter called Hauntologies.net. I'm trying to update it semi-regularly on sometimes similar themes to what we're talking about, what we talked about here. And obviously there's the Patreon for the project that supports this podcast, as well as the podcast of Ayman and Israa, which I'll invite you to mention as well. Called From the Periphery, which is the media collective. It's kind of the umbrella term for everything we do. And to support us, you just go on patreon.com/fromtheperiphery.
You can follow me on Blue Sky at Ayman Mac, or on Instagram at Politically Depressed. Yeah, I've got the podcast Politically Depressed, and with Israa, the podcast, the Mutual Aid podcast.
Yep. And you could follow me on Instagram and Blue Sky at Israa,
A number of S's.
3 A's. Yeah, 4 S's.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. See you all next time.